There are few words to describe the simple pleasure of sinking your foot into the accelerator of a car. So I personally confess to taking every chance I can to do it. But I'm not the only one to like this habit. I'd say Americans in general love powerful engines. So we take a look back to the 60s and 70s, the era of the muscle car, we see that this was true. So these muscle cars had hefty V8 engines that produced a significant amount of power. But the power did, however, come at a cost. Very poor fuel mileage. Take the 1969 Mustang Boss 429, for example. It produced 375 horsepower, but only had an MPG rating of 8.1 miles per gallon. So we can imagine this car would be very expensive to drive nowadays with gas at over $4 a gallon. So for this reason, car companies are turning more from powerful engines to more fuel-efficient vehicles. And this usually results in smaller engines or even hybrid engines. So it kills off the powerful roar of a Mustang and it replaces it with the very silent sound of a Prius. Sorry. For those of you that don't have a problem with the Prius, like for car enthusiasts, that's kind of a tragedy. But for people that don't have a problem with the Prius, consider 50 years from now when people look back at our times and they compare the Mustang and the Prius. Which one would you think people would say is a classic car? Any thoughts? I don't think anyone would say the Prius because it doesn't seek to engage its driver or be a fun car to drive. It only wants to be a fuel-efficient vehicle. So cars aren't the only thing to be affected by high gas prices. Consider anything that relies on oil. And a specific example is that white chair over there. So we're going to consider that chair right now. So the plastic in that chair is a petroleum product. And the metal was mined and refined using oil-dependent machinery. So after it was assembled, it was taken by a semi-truck to a store where a purchaser bought it and drove it back in their gasoline-powered vehicle to its current location, right there. All right, so we can imagine that when the price of oil rises, every aspect of making that chair and transporting it also becomes more expensive. So for this reason, it's important to know what situations cause higher gas prices. One situation that comes to my mind is peak oil. What exactly is peak oil? It's the theory that suggests that one day we're going to reach a maximum oil production, after which production will move in a general downward trend. And it's not so much debated whether it will happen, because we know oil is finite, and therefore it cannot have infinite growth. But it's more a matter of when it will happen, and this definitely plays a role in how we should perceive and act accordingly to peak oil. So before considering the origins of where this theory came from, let's consider the difference between conventional and unconventional oil. So conventional oil is our most common form of oil. It's also called crude oil. So it's very cheap and very popular. So it comes in a liquid state and we could put it in a pipeline and send it straight to the refinery where it's made into different products, like plastic, for example, or gasoline. Unconventionals, on the other hand, come in more of a solid state. So consider shale oil, oil sands. They have to be mined and then transported in a vehicle to the first refinery that breaks them down into smaller compounds where they're then sent off into a pipeline to the final stage of refining. But this added layer of production makes unconventionals more expensive than crude oil. And for this reason, they haven't been too popular in the past. But lately, they're attracting a lot of attention because they're a very large resource. Therefore, well, they're popular now, and people are investing a lot in them. So now let's consider the man who came up with the idea of peak oil. His name was M. King Hubbert, and he was a geophysicist that worked for Shell starting in 1943. So his position let him have a considerable amount of information about American oil production, and using this information, in 1956 he predicted that American oil production would peak within the next 15 years. And the impressive part about this was that he was actually correct. In 1970, American oil production peaked. So he went on to attempt to predict world oil production, which he said would occur in the year 2000. However, this wasn't the case because ever since we've continued to experience growth in production. But his main contribution isn't so much his method in predicting peak oil, but more introducing the idea that we can actually reach a maximum oil production. Let's now consider what risk management is. And this is going to be important when we deal with the actual solution or a possible solution to dealing with the economic effects of peak oil. So consider this theoretical weather report that states that sometime this week it's going to rain, but we're not too sure when. So a person finds himself at the store and they have to walk home afterwards. So risk management is the process of evaluating the risk behind walking home with the chance of rain. So if the person walks home and it rains, he's going to get sick. So the smart thing to do would be to buy a raincoat. But the problem is that he only has enough money to buy a raincoat or his groceries. So what's he going to do? If he buys the raincoat and he walks home and it rains, then it's a smart investment because he protected his health. But if it doesn't rain, it was a premature investment. And later we'll see how when dealing with the economic effects of peak oil, this is a similar situation. So a certain application of risk management is government regulation, especially as it relates to market failure. So an example of this is the Food and Drug Administration. So if we consider the FDA, when it was formed in 1906, it was in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And in this book, he exposes the malpractices of the meatpacking industry. So at the time, the main problem with the industry was that it was very unsanitary. So what the FDA did was come in and ensure that the meat would be safe for consumers by inspecting it. The reason we consider this a market failure is because companies are driven by profit. So a company can make more money if they don't have to worry about the expense of sanitation. And the FDA to this day continues to ensure that there's safe products for consumers. And for this year alone, actually, it's recalled several products for reasons ranging from lack of sterility to containing salmonella. And by doing so, it's been able to protect consumers. So what suggests that global oil production will peak in the near future? Well, global oil production has ceased to grow fast enough to keep up with demand. And soon there's going to be a deficit that not even unconventional oil will be able to solve. So this imminent peak in production is an example of a market failure, and it will bring with it serious economic consequences. But with timely mitigation and government regulation to aid the effort, these problems can actually be resolved. Where does crude oil production stand today? As of November 2012, the world produced 75.66 million barrels per day. So that's quite a lot of oil. But if we consider demand in this same year, it was 89.12 million barrels per day. That means there was a deficit of 13.46 million barrels per day that crude did not fill. In the future, we can expect consumption and production of oil to continue rising. But as these numbers show, consumption grows at a much faster pace. And why is it unlikely for crude oil production to continue rising? So for there to be a net increase, there has to be enough oil or increase in oil production to make up for losses in any other areas. So current conventional production decline rate in existing crude oil fields varies anywhere from 4% to 6%, and that adds up to about 4 million barrels per day loss of production. So that means for the next year to have a net growth, there has to be at least this increase of 4 million barrels per day, and there has to be enough beyond that to make a significant impact. If a company can improve how fast they can extract their oil, but they can't replace the one they are extracting, then soon their reserves will begin to dry up and their production along with it. So it's here where companies find a problem, replacing their used up oil wells. In a quote by David Goodstein, and he's a Caltech physicist, he says that oil geologists have gone to the ends of the earth to search out big fields, and he says it's very unlikely that another big one will be found. So with less oil discoveries, there will be less oil production along with it. What can be said about the future of our oil demand? Consider countries such as India and China that are experiencing economic growth currently. So car sales contribute significantly to oil consumption because they are the main user of oil. China, for example, is predicted to grow 74% to reach 30.6 million cars by 2020. And in India, they're expected to sell 11 million cars by 2020. And that's almost a 1,600% increase from the year 2000. The growth in these emerging economies will significantly increase global oil consumption, but by how much exactly? The International Energy Agency says that by 2035, there will be a 35% increase in global consumption. That means that there must also be a 35% increase in production to go along with it. When oil peaks, what will be the economic effects that come with the event? The most immediate effect is a jump in oil prices. If there were to be a $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil, that would mean that GDP growth would slow by 0.2% the first year and 0.5% the year following. This can be attributed slightly in part to less consumer spending because of higher prices on goods. An article in the Augusta Chronicle analyzed how much the price of goods, specifically on food and apparel, rose in the years that oil also increased. So in 2011 to 2012, the price in oil in Augusta increased by 9.7%. And in that respective time, food increased by 4.4% and the price of apparel by 4.7%. So when consumers spend less, companies make less profits. Companies are also directly affected by the higher price of gas because it makes their transportation and manufacturing costs more expensive. So then they're faced with either making cuts or raising the price of their goods, and both of these can result in a loss of profits. So what solutions and mitigations exist to resolve this problem? There's two. The first is to reduce our dependence on oil, and the second is to ensure that there's enough other liquid fuel sources to make up for the loss. Unconventionals are the most likely to meet this new demand because there's a large resource of them, so they can increase production significantly. This is partly an effect, but unconventionals in their current state aren't increasing sufficiently to cover a demand, nor are they as cheap as crude oil, which can result in more economic problems. But both these drawbacks, given enough time and investment, can be remedied. So the above solutions are the mitigations necessary to address peak oil and its problems and its issues that come along with it. So there has to be a risk manager to ensure that the solutions above are successfully completed. So in the example that I gave earlier of the weather report, the theoretical weather report, it's very similar to peak oil. So we know that it's going to happen, but we don't know when it's going to happen. Also, there's the risk involved of a premature investment. And a premature investment in this case would be a problem because the money and attention directed towards oil production could have been directed to something else if the peak wasn't to occur in a significant time frame. So with a risk manager, both these solutions, given enough time to solve these problems, can actually be solved. So when dealing with peak oil, there has to be a sort of a risk manager. And in companies, the risk manager is played by the role of executives. But who is the risk manager in the free market? One solution is the government. So how would the government exactly help in dealing with peak oil? So my solution is that government should form a new agency formed at evaluating US liquid fuel production. And this new agency should collaborate, and I do want to specify on collaborate, with American oil companies and evaluate projected growth in consumption and production. And they should see if these are going to meet in the future, and then they should see what actions they can take to ensure that this happens. So I described the agency with a very rough outline because there's a lot of factors involved in oil production. But the noteworthy aspect is, once again, the collaboration between government and the free market. So considering these necessary mitigations, how much time do we need before the peak to actually start these? A certain report by Robert Hirsch in 2005 concluded that by commencing a certain crash program in preparation for the peak 20 years before would result in a smoother and less severe transition from pre to post peak. So the solution then must be to have enough time to address these problems. But when is the peak going to occur? Current predictions estimate the peak anywhere from 2016 to after 2025. So this leads us to believe that action has to be taken very soon. Some believe that government intervention, rather than being helpful to the free market, is a nuisance to economic growth. So consider the solutions that the free market gives. After the peak occurs, there's going to be shortages in oil. The free market would say that this shortage would be met by unconventionals. But the problem with this is because the price of oil would raise so much that unconventionals for companies would be extremely profitable. But for consumers, that would result in higher gas prices, and along with it, all the economic effects we analyzed. So this leads me to believe that using the government, because they have a longer vision than the free market, because as we already discussed, the free market is driven by profit, so it's very short-sighted. But using the government, we'll be able to address these problems in a timely manner. Driving a car can be a very fun experience, and car enthusiasts owe it all to cars that we can have simple moments of happiness at the wheel of a car. And even for those that aren't too enthused by cars, they owe it all to oil that you can move from point A to point B in a timely fashion. And oil has become a necessity in our current life, and it's important that it has a plentiful amount of oil and at a reasonable price. And peak oil threatens both these attributes of oil by causing shortages and increasing the price of oil. So in order to prevent and protect ourselves from the threat of peak oil, we have to take action, of which I suggested government regulation. So the important part is not so much to follow my solution, but to follow a solution. And for this reason, let us all take action and prepare ourselves for the coming peak.